Hello, friends. My name is Pam, and welcome to the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, January 22nd. Let's begin. Capitol assault. Why did police show up on both sides of the thin blue line? By Patrick Johnson. Savannah, Georgia. In 40 years as an Appalachian cop, George Irwin Jr. came to this conclusion: only a thin blue line separates good from evil. But Mr. Irwin, the former sheriff of North Carolina's Henderson County, says he saw those lines blur at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. My whole thing is that when you've got people who are going out here and saying they back the blue, and the next thing you know, you've got people carrying back the blue flags, dragging officers down steps, and beating them with a flagpole and his own nightstick, you don't go there with me, says Mr. Irwin. The vast majority of officers fought valiantly to protect lawmakers from harm. One officer died, 60 were injured, and the department lost another to suicide. But Capitol Police has opened as many as a dozen investigations into reports that officers aided the mob, and at least 2 have been suspended. Sworn officers were also on the other side, joining the rioters, a fact that has Mr. Irwin shaking his head. More than 24 officers are under investigation for their participation in January 6th events. If officers went up there and did that, that's a criminal act, and you ought to be held accountable like everybody else. As the FBI braces the country for more trouble ahead of President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration, the attack on the Capitol revealed a troubling national blind spot: the political radicalization of police that predates the presidency of Donald Trump. Many Americans are struggling to understand the dynamics of right-wing terrorism, including the role of law enforcement officers and military personnel, and how rhetoric and mass psychology help to answer a fundamental question: who do police protect, and who do they protect them from? So often we tend to look at far-right militancy as something on the fringes of our society, tantamount to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, without realizing that, no, these are members of state legislature, police officers, military personnel, says former FBI agent Michael German, who infiltrated and prosecuted neo-Nazi groups in 1990. He argues that the potential threat to public safety from the far right is much greater, given the cloak of authority under which these extremists can operate. Their capabilities are actually on par with any foreign terrorist group, if not greater. They don't just have the passion of their beliefs. What they have is government sanction. A failure of imagination? Since 2000, more than 24 states have unmasked police officers with connections to white supremacist groups. Hundreds of federal, state, and local law enforcement officials have been caught expressing racist, nativist, and sexist views on social media, according to a September 2020 report by the Brennan Center for Justice in New York. Those facts provide an uneasy backdrop to the January 6th attack, where police leaders seemingly underestimated the threat, leaving the crucible of democracy vulnerable to the mob. The former chief of U.S. Capitol Police, who resigned in the aftermath, has said that security officials at the House and Senate declined to call in the National Guard in advance of a rally, which included remarks by President Trump that had been hyped as a final showdown. Larger failures of imagination added to biases of individual police officers are part of what analysts say make police reform so difficult and makes radicalization among officers possible. Making the issue harder for Americans to see is institutional discomfort at the FBI, in particular, to confront the problem publicly. The FBI tells its agents, for instance, to not discuss white supremacy cases around local police for fear of tip-offs, says Mr. German. Meanwhile, Congress has struggled to get data to compare the agency's response to Black Lives Matter's protests against right-wing extremist activities last year, which killed dozens of Americans, including officers. In 2019, the FBI established the Domestic Terrorism Hate Crimes Fusion Cell, but in its reporting to Congress, it has lumped in Antifa and anti-fascist movements with right-wing extremists like Boogaloos, an equivalency that critics say muddies the threat that should be prioritized. Brian Cora, past president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, says the history of U.S. slave patrols has cast a long shadow in black communities. This contrasts with the story that cops tell themselves that the public are the police and the police are the public, he says. Both of these are historically true, but part of what's happening in our society is that people are unable to hold competing truths. For many, there is only one truth. Either police are corrupt and violent and racist, or they're heroes that run towards gunfire when we run away from it, says Mr. Core. That divide has only sharpened under President Trump, who has at times attempted to blur the line between politics and policing. He invoked law and order when he sent federal police to quell protests in Portland, Oregon, against the wishes of local authorities, and used them last June to clear peaceful protests from Washington's Lafayette Square so he could be photographed holding a Bible outside a church. His militaristic rhetoric on the border has also energized Border Patrol members. Right-wing threats. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, right-wing groups were responsible for 41 politically motivated attacks and plots last year, including attacks that killed police officers in Santa Cruz and Oakland, California, Kimberly, Alabama, and Ely, Nevada. There were 12 left-wing attacks and plots in the same period. Police officers were also hurt and some seriously injured, at times by gunfire, during last summer's social justice protests. Still, lethal threats to law enforcement have primarily come from right-wing extremists. That is what's hard to understand about the apparent affinity in law enforcement for far-right militants at riots, says Mr. German. Analysts say the policing of Black Lives Matter protests and of protests by whites and armed participants reflect that affinity. Last August, when pro-police groups rallied in Kenosha, Wisconsin to face down racial justice protesters, police handed out water bottles to militiamen, including Kyle Rittenhouse, an armed white teen who allegedly shot dead 2 men and injured a third. To many analysts, the preparation for pro-Trump protests at the Capitol was perhaps the ultimate expression of that bias in terms of which groups pose a threat to public safety. Meanwhile, pandemic malaise, social unrest, and on-the-job traumas endured by police officers, particularly military veterans, have likely boosted radicalization in the ranks. While veterans make up about 6% of the population, nearly 1 in 5 police officers previously served in the military, according to a 2017 analysis of U.S. Census data. Folks go into these dangerous places and come back disillusioned with their own government and come back with a counterinsurgency mindset and techniques, says Boston University law professor Robert Say, author of Practical Equality: Forging Justice in a Divided Nation. One of the potential consequences is that more right-wing office holders demand that police join their political efforts, their political aims. And when law enforcement becomes politicized, it becomes radicalized. Former Baltimore police officer Peter Moskos agreed that the January 6th attack likely caused a reckoning for police unions that tend to reflectively blame racial justice protests for endangering police. But he points to how law enforcement, a naturally conservative institution that is often the target of progressive critics, actually performed in the hours-long siege at the Capitol. Yeah, there are racists in police departments, but that's not the problem we're facing now, says Mr. Moskos, now a criminologist at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. At some level, they failed miserably, but that said, one of them got killed and they literally fought, died, and saved our democracy. Those words aren't often said. battered public trust? Still, professionalism is key for police to maintain a public trust that has been battered over the last year, in part because of the anger stirred by the killing last May of George Floyd and the police response to months of protests across the country. The FBI on Wednesday arrested 2 Rocky Mount, Virginia police officers, both military veterans, including one who was injured in an improvised explosive device attack in Iraq, after they posted pictures of themselves inside the Capitol. The men said they were welcomed in, but also said in social media posts that they attacked the building. They face charges of trespassing, disorderly conduct, and using threatening or abusive language inside the Capitol. The Seattle Police Department is investigating 2 officers for their role in the insurrection at the Capitol. Oath Keepers, an anti-government militia that boasts of having military and police among its members, were also on hand last week. According to the Anti-Defamation League, Oath Keepers aim much of their propaganda at military and police, reminding them that their oath to the Constitution includes defending it from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Their propaganda is of a global order that must be resisted by patriots, lest they are disarmed and sent to concentration camps. Among those who didn't go to Washington last week was former Sheriff Richard Mack of Arizona's Graham County, the founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. "I was browbeat for not going, but I just had a bad feeling about it," said Mr. Mack. "The bottom line is, a lot of people are frustrated in this country, and I understand that frustration, and that frustration comes from both Republicans and Democrats making a mockery of our Constitution. But I will never support violence, and my message remains the same to all police and all military. Keep your oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. That's how we will fix this problem and restore the peace." Still, some point to Mr. Mack's organization as a possible nexus for police operating outside the bounds of the Constitution. Constitutional sheriffs contend that they have the power to rebuff federal laws that they, not judges, deem unconstitutional, and they have vowed not to enforce gun restrictions and mask mandates. You see, a lot of these self-described constitutional sheriffs also active in the militia movement, says Mr. Say, who see a slippery path to radicalization in sheriff activism. They are now endangered in anti-mask, anti-pandemic actions, and they proudly say, "We're not going to enforce these things." They are part of this broader right-wing politicization of law enforcement. Our next article is titled, "Plantation Tours Bypass the Big House to Focus on the Enslaved," by Noah Robertson and Lindsay McGinnis. Beside the long path to the Wapoo Creek stand symmetrical rows of southern live oaks, arranged like the pillars of a temple. Down the dirt road below, shaded by the leaves and long beards of the Spanish moss, Toby Smith leads her first tour of the morning to the Wapoo's marshy banks. Then she adds them to look right. Miles away, past mud flats, fishing boats, and the Ashley River, sits Charleston, South Carolina. If they drifted on the water for about an hour, they'd hit the city harbor. If they floated past for another 3 months, she said, they'd arrive on the west coast of Africa. That's how Miss Smith says she starts her tour of McLeod Plantation Historic Site, where she's worked as a guide for the past 2 years. Her trip to the milky green waters of the Wapoo Creek is a regular pilgrimage designed to help visitors imagine the journey of enslaved Africans who once stood on the same land. Starting near the water, she says, lets the tour walk in their footsteps. For the next hour, Miss Smith explains in a phone interview, she guides her group through the plantation grounds and lets them ask questions about its 37 acres. They pass the cramped slave quarters and palatial manor house. They pause at the slave cemetery and walk into the fields of Sea Island cotton still growing. Inside the cotton gin house, they gaze at small dimples in the walls. Some days, Miss Smith lets the group know that those are fingerprints left by enslaved children who hand-molded the bricks. "We are walking on the blood, sweat, and tears of real human beings," she often tells visitors. That has a very profound impact on people. Sometimes you don't have to say anything, it's just the presence. McLeod is among a growing number of sites that recognize the power of that presence. Its vision is to interpret the legacy of slavery where slavery took place. Behind that, the focus is a recognition that the history of American slavery has been insufficiently and inaccurately told, often privileging the enslaved over the enslavers over the enslaved. Gradually, that's changing as historians acknowledge that every life on plantations like McLeod mattered. Reconstructing their lives of enslaved people is difficult, but from Wallace, Louisiana to Medford, Massachusetts, many sites on the ground zero of slavery are accepting their role in that effort. Recent calls for racial justice have demanded a reckoning with wrongs that date back centuries. Places like McLeod harbor that history, and with it, hopes for catharsis. We are the stewards of spaces that can offer answers, says Michelle Lanier, director of the North Carolina Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. There's a grand healing that I think is attempting to emerge through our nation's greatest wound. Basically, we've been miseducated. For many Americans, that wound has grown more painful with the way it has historically been taught, says Derek Aldridge, a professor at the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education and Human Development. Dr. Aldridge recently chaired Virginia's Commission on African American History Education, charged with auditing the state's efforts to teach Black history. Released last August, its 80-page report identifies fault epidemic to curricula across the country. Long dominant have been so-called master narratives, which teach American history through the lives of U.S. presidents or other great men. People of color, and especially African Americans, are often segregated into sections that cover only messianic figures, like the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Regular Black Americans, including enslaved people, are rarely given space. You can't erase history. You can't ignore it, which is something we've done for centuries, says Jody Allen, an assistant professor of history at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. There's a real understanding that basically we've been miseducated in this country. Understanding the legacy of slavery, says Professor Aldridge, is crucial to addressing its impacts today. Connecting historical dots from the Black Lives Matter movement to the Civil Rights Movement to abolition puts the present in context and makes history real, he says. At a place like McLeod, where that history is as real as it can get, the stakes for getting it right are high. Bypassing the big house. Just as the historical narrative has traditionally focused on the owning class, plantation museums have orbited the big house, says Sean Halifax, Cultural History Interpretation Coordinator for the Charleston County Park and Recreation Commission, which runs McLeod. Typically, visitors marvel at the opulent homes of slave owners, he says, while enslaved people are treated as footnotes. The furnishing of these former dwellings oftentimes tends to create a type of nostalgia, which is the very thing that through our interpretation we're trying to move beyond, says Mr. Halifax. At McLeod, the big house is empty, and the tour does not take visitors inside. Interpreters teach about William Wallace McLeod, the plantation's owner and a Confederate soldier, but they focus on the 100 or so people enslaved on the site, telling their stories and saying their names. More than 800 miles southwest, Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana, takes the same approach. Before the pandemic, the former sugarcane plantation attracted about 100,000 visitors each year, says Executive Director Ashley Rogers. It's like McLeod teaches slavery from the perspective of enslaved people and will soon empty its big house. We're trying to use this plantation as a vehicle to get people to understand the system of slavery more broadly, says Mr. Rogers. One way they do that is by making sure Whitney's history speaks to today. Only 2 of the original 22 slave quarters are still standing, but they aren't relics. After the Civil War, many of Whitney's enslaved people had little choice but to keep farming sugarcane and living in their same quarters. Some of their descendants stayed until 1975. Our entire point of what we're trying to do is teach people about the past so that they can understand the present, says Mr. Rogers. If history doesn't have an impact that you can still feel, then it's just an interesting story. Seeing today through the lens of yesterday. Sometimes the past and the present collide. Jennifer Stacy grew up near Charlottesville, Virginia, about 10 miles from Highland, the plantation of President James Monroe. Her family used to drive past the site on their way to town, and she would read the sign, Home of James Monroe. She knew about slavery, and she knew her grandfather was also a Monroe. Even as a girl, she sensed the two were somehow connected. Decades later, Miss Stacy learned that she's a descendant of Ned Monroe, an enslaved man at Highland, who helped build the University of Virginia. 3 years ago, she joined the estate's newly formed Council of Descendant Advisors, a group of 10 descendants who advise the site on its efforts to tell a fuller story. It's now shared authority, where the goal is to reinterpret the history there and to get it right, Miss Stacy says. The true deep down hope is that this could be a roadmap to something bigger that our whole country can get behind and start doing, because it is who we are. Highland, like other plantation sites across the country, is researching the lives of those enslaved on its land, constructing genealogies, reviewing oral histories, and panning streams of centuries-old documents. The task, though, requires swimming against the currents of history. Researchers engaged in this work often face a dearth of primary sources, low funds, and small staffs. This is especially true in the North. Records show slavery is central to Northern states' histories. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and other influential figures in the North who supported abolition-owned slaves and New England colonies played a critical role in the transatlantic slave trade. There were enslaved people in every Rhode Island township, historians say, and local merchants bankrolled more than 500 voyages to West Africa during the colonial period. All the other colonies combined sent 189. But Americans' postbellum memory associates slavery almost exclusively with former Confederate states. Research on slavery outside the South is thin. A long-held notion of Northern heroism can chill attempts to learn more. Correcting the record. This is the great desire for people who want us to have made greater strides, but we are working against 50-plus years of America's educational system, says Lavada Nahan, interpreter of African American history for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. While many sites in the North are adopting an approach similar to Whitney's or McLeod's, rediscovering an entire state's role in slavery is a massive effort in historical forensics. Artifacts have been mislabeled and misinterpreted, and important history has been lost in translation. In New York, this could mean translating early documents from Dutch to English or interpreting confusing terminology. A recent paper published by the Schuler Mansion State Historic Site in Albany argues that the servants listed in Alexander Hamilton's cash book were actually enslaved people. Even cursive handwriting can challenge the newer generation of historians. It is not as if we are choosing not to honor our ancestors, Ms. Nahon says. It is time-consuming work. It's also work that involves Heidi Hill, historic site manager at Schuler Mansion, says the site has been compiling research on free and enslaved Africans since 1980s. They've long incorporated names, numbers, and the type of work enslaved people did into their tours and other events. But now we're asking different questions, says Ms. Hill. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Who were their family members? And how did they connect? Piecing together the lives of enslaved people. When communicating with a largely miseducated public, making the historical narrative more inclusive requires a powerful commitment. Kyra Singleton heard about the Royal House and slave quarters in Medford, Massachusetts at a conference in 2019. She'd grown up in the Northeast, studied slavery, and still had no idea there were freestanding slave quarters in the North. But while the scholar in her wanted to visit, Miss Singleton had a familiar fear that the history would be whitewashed and the trip would be more painful than illuminating. Still, she decided to go and soon learned that the site had undergone a dramatic rebranding in 2005, bringing enslaved people into focus. Every room that we went in, we talked about the enslaved people, she said. It shows that their names matter, their lives matter, their history matters. Miss Singleton was so impressed that she applied to work at the museum, and since April of last year, she has served as executive director. In her new role, Miss Singleton is eager to uncover how the enslaved people who lived at the site experienced slavery, resisted it, and advocated for their freedom, a challenging mission that includes archaeological and archival research, partnering with universities, and a lot of guesswork. You might not find all of the information that you want, she admits, and that's a part of the cruelty of history in many ways. Whose lives were deemed important enough to document versus those whose lives were deemed unimportant. The paucity of first-person accounts of slavery has long been an excuse to avoid difficult conversations, says Cordell Reeves, Historic Preservation Programs Analyst for New York's Office of Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation. That is a terrible disservice to the general public, he says. Visitors can be engaged in having a conversation around ongoing research, even if we're not absolutely certain about the outcome. Lately, Miss Singleton has been working to increase the visibility of the Royal House and slave quarters, hoping to expand the site's role in present-day social justice movements by helping communities understand that last year's assault against Black people, including by the police, were not unique. This history of injustice has been happening long before 2020, says Ms. Singleton. It will keep happening if we don't actually confront systemic inequalities and racism in this country. Interrupting the cycle of history? The country has chosen not to confront the history before, and the history repeats. Generations come, generations go. The next sometimes forgets the last. But places like McLeod remember, says Miss Smith, the interpreter near Charleston. Her tour ends, she says, at the Wyndham Oak, thought to be at least 200 years old. Miss Smith asks her group to imagine what memories are caught in its branches. Miss Smith tells her group that she is a direct descendant of slaves, some of whom may have lived just 20 miles from McLeod. Her great-great-grandmother, Idella, was taken from modern-day Ghana in the 1840s, after the slave trade was illegal in America. Miss Smith is alive today because Idella survived that voyage at the age of 8, mourned her losses alone, and started a family, living until 1941. This work is a way for me to keep them alive, share their memories, and also give them a measure of honor and dignity that they never had in life, says Miss Smith. Then at the roots of the Wyndham Oak, she tells her group about a visitor to McLeod 6 years ago. A month before Dylann Roof killed 9 members of Emmanuel African American Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He visited McLeod and took pictures of himself there. People physically recoil at the fact that he was on the property, says Miss Smith, but it gives us an opportunity to talk about hatred and why we cannot let hate end the conversation. There's no agenda, no judgment, no attempt to sanitize what went on then or now, she says. It's just a moment to pause, to acknowledge the pain, and to ask what they'll do about it. Maybe listen to each other or the ancient oak above them. Ultimately, we hope that it could be a place always of conversation and healing, says Miss Smith, and people will leave better than when they came. And that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, January 22nd. This is Pam asking you to stay safe, be blessed, and make it a great day. Thank you for having me in your home.